Okay. Anne McDuffie is an author of poems, essays, and reviews. She graduated from Oberlin College and Rainer Writing Workshop at Pacific Lutheran University. She has earned many awards, such as the Jack Straw Fellowship and Individual Artist Projects Grant. She began working with Madeline DeFries in 2007 and became the executive of her company after her death in 2015. McDuffie is currently living in Seattle. Winter Wheat is a story about a grandchild and their grandpa, while the grandpa keeps fantasizing about stories about his past. The grandchild just listens. The grandpa just wants to impress his grandchildren so that they don't leave him. This can be seen by how often the grandpa buys houses to try to impress his family. I believe the theme of this essay is acceptance. Acceptance because in the essay, the grandchild had to accept that they were never going to see their grandpa again. Another instance of the theme of acceptance are the grandpa's stories. His stories were fake with a little bit of truth in them, and the main characters had to accept that they were fake even though they didn't want to. And the grandpa fails to accept that his stories aren't true. We know this because the narrator says that the grandpa would argue with anyone that questioned the truth of his stories. My thoughts on the essay's content are good. For me, there was no clear theme, and I had trouble coming up with one. It was very well developed and has lots of detail. The unity is all right, except for one instance. In the end of the essay, the narrator talks about the grandpa when all of a sudden they switch to talking about the daydream that the narrator's having. This part left me confused about what happened. It touches it touches us with the grandpa and the connections we make with him. It's sad to see the grandpa go at the end. Regarding to the style, the verbs used in the essays paint pictures. For example, in the second sentence of the essay, the narrator says, only once fingered the stiff fan of its beard, plucked a kernel, and held it in my mouth. This sentence paints a clear picture of their first experience with wheat. The unit uh, it sticks to first person and past tense, nor does it switch. There were no run-ons that I could find. This story does meet Zinser's wisdom. It has no clutter that I could find. As Zinser has said before, the beginning and the ending are one of the most important parts of an essay. The beginning of the story hooks the reader into reading more with its descriptive words. The ending left us with questions about what happened. Leaving the reader with questions can sometimes be good, but this time I don't think it was. All of the adverbs are needed and aren't a waste of space. An example of this is the following sentence. Grandpa rarely repeated himself. Rarely is needed in the sentence. If it were to be removed, it wouldn't have the same meaning. McDuffie did a good job of meeting Zinser's wisdom. I'm done.
So I was the language expert, so I'm just going to go over some aspects of like grammar and how the author uses grammar to like paint a good picture and how it helps shape the story. So one thing was the repetition of the use of colons, as the writer describes how her grandpa made her feel and how she was able to go into further detail with her emotions. In paragraph 7 of the story, she writes, they talked of a man who was known for his practical jokes, who loved a good gag. And then she does a colon and then says, oh, we laughed. Claire would always make us laugh. And so the use of the colons helps us connect the writer and gives us insight into the type of person her grandfather was. And it kind of helps back up all the stories that her grandfather tells. And then in the second sentence of the story is an example of a good lead, basically like the first two sentences. So I'm going to read them out. So I have seen wheat only once in my life. Only once fingered the stiff fan of its beard, plucked a kernel, and held it in its mouth. So this is one memory the writer has that reminds her of her grandfather and how he was excited to show her the field of wheat. It's also kind of symbolic because later in the paragraph, she mentions that she doesn't remember his house, but she remembers the details around it, including the wheat field. So it kind of shows that she had a good relationship with her grandfather, and the wheat field is like one memory in specific that she has of him. And then it's also a good lead because she's describing the wheat in detail, and it gives the reader a sense of curiosity, like, because she basically says, I have seen wheat only once in my life. So that could make the reader curious as to what is coming next. And so I think Zinsser would like that because obviously he talked a lot about like what would be a good lead in his chapter. And so it is a sentence fragment, but it follows the first sentence and keeps the reader interested. So it's kind of helpful to have in there. And then in paragraph 2, as the writer is describing the crazy stories her grandpa would tell, she explains that nobody really believed him. Like certain people would, like they obviously knew that certain details of his stories were accurate, but for the most part, she says, but the rest, they'd shake their heads baffled. And she does use an ellipses in that she says, but the rest, ... they'd shake their heads baffled. And I think the ellipses helps highlight the confusion that people felt when they heard his crazy stories, and just the fact that none of it was really true, but those were like memories that she had of her grandfather is him telling those stories. And then the description used in the first 8 paragraphs of the writing helps us lead to when the writer is explaining how many family members at his funeral were experiencing their own grief and had stories of their own to tell about him. It just makes more sense when we know the type of character he was and when we see all the stories that he told and how he impacted other people's lives, like the people close to him. I'm done.
Okay, I have the Zendik expert, and for humanity, I think we really touch and connect with the audience because at the end of the day, in our lives, like someone passes away in our lives, and like we like remember what they did in life and all that stuff. And then for the second one, it said, I think it was well organized on the paragraphs, and each paragraph had their own like story, and like she explained in each paragraph like how like just like different stories that her grandfather did in his lifetime. And then clarity in terms of like sense and all that, it was like really straightforward, although like in the beginning I kind of got confused because I didn't know what it was gonna be about. And then like in the second paragraph I started to realize it was about her grandfather. And then the focus was not much on what she was feeling, but rather than how her family reacted to her grandfather and the impact he made in their lives. And then variety, I said it did have some descriptive words, and it was easy for us to picture and to imagine in our heads. Yeah, I'm done.